One thing I've been thinking about recently, as I've been thinking about things like the women's rights movement and the men's rights movement, and kind of how these two movements have interacted with each other recently. And really, the big argument you've seen coming from the women's rights side is that they say, well, men have had all the historical power. Therefore, we don't really need a men's rights movement because men are already in power. And, I've thought about this argument, and, at first it's pretty convincing. You're like, well, yeah, men generally do hold most of the power positions in entertainment and in government, and in most of these locations, they do hold a lot of power positions. And so you're kind of like, it seems like a pretty good argument. But when I look at this argument in a broader historical context, like in a broader context, just taking into account most movements against oppression throughout history, the one thing that I tend to notice is that every single movement against oppression has been a back and forth seesaw. And by that I mean is that when you have an oppressed group that advocates for rights, at some point in time, the group that was viewed as the oppressor eventually has to come back around and advocate for its own rights, because at some point the oppressed become the oppressors. And I think the best example you can really give of this is the workers' rights movement. The workers' rights movement, it started in the 19th century. It started pretty much because businesses were abusing the rights of employees. They were stepping on their rights, and because of that, workers unionized, and they gathered, and they formed workers' movements to try to get rights for workers. And what came out of this, though? What was the eventual results? The result was socialism and communism. Those were two movements that did what? They took away the rights of businesses, and they took away the rights of private property owners. And then what happened at that point? Well, at that point, businesses and property owners had to form their own rights movements. They had to go and try to fight for their own rights. So at that point, it was a seesaw. The oppressed had become the oppressors through socialism and communism. And then the oppressors had to form their own rights movements to counteract what was going on. And eventually, that kind of seesaw fought itself out till we're somewhere in the middle where we kind of are now, where we kind of have this kind of mixed market economy, where you have businesses that will sometimes abuse rights, and now you have workers that will sometimes abuse rights. And it's kind of a back and forth seesaw. Another great example, I think, would probably be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you look at that, I don't think anyone's going to deny that Jews are a historically oppressed group. They've been oppressed in every single society they've been in. Now, if you're one of these alt-right 1488 people and you think they secretly run everything, I don't know what to tell you about that. But for the most part, Jews have been a minority, and they've had a lot of problems in society. But if you look at Israel today, it's a Jewish state. The Jews hold the majority, all the power. It's a Jewish state. And the Palestinians, who are mostly a Muslim and sometimes Christian minority, because of this, have seen some of their rights being eroded by the Israelis, the traditionally oppressed group. So in that area of the world, in certain circumstances, not every circumstance. Obviously, Israel does a lot of good things, and they've had a lot of problems with the people over there. But in some instances, they have become the oppressors. Like the Jews, the historically oppressed groups, have in certain instances become the oppressors. And that's another example of kind of this seesaw we see. We see groups that are oppressed eventually become oppressors. And so when I go back and I look at something like the men's rights movement and the women's rights movement, I see the same thing going on. Yeah, women have been oppressed. They've had a lot of problems. But as we see as the seesaw, as feminism has become more powerful in society, we see that feminists are in certain circumstances becoming the oppressors. And because of that, the seesaw is shifting back, and men are now starting to organize, and they're starting to get behind men's movements and to try to counteract some of that. And I think that will probably happen is it will seesaw itself out till we end up somewhere in the middle. And once we end up in that middle ground, I think we're going to be a lot better off.